For those that don't know me, I'm Ross Stewart. I'm the curator of the museum here, and you met me earlier on today. I hope you've all had a wonderful day. There have been some great events. We've had the bus tour, the jeep tour, and the unveiling of the bench for Parry Webb. I'm going to speak a little bit about Parry later in this. Wethersfield and me, I actually came here when the Americans left in 1991, but I decided not to stay here, and the training school of which I was a course director in had just moved here, or was moving here, but I decided on promotion to go back to Scotland for a while. But I came here in the year 2000, and between 1991 and 2000, I was here several times because I held a staff officer post, and that brought me to Wethersfield a lot. I liked it here, and he offered me a job here to do police radio. So that's how I ended up coming to be here. But from 2000 to 2008, I really wasn't interested in the history of the place. To be honest, I was far too busy doing the project that I was here to do, police radios. But one day you'll see what happened, and I did get interested in the history, and that's why we're here today. This is the area. There's Wethersfield down here where this blue airplane is. This was World War II. These are all airfields. Yeah? Many of them American airfields. The B for bomber, there was fighter airfields for escorts for the bombs. I was talking earlier just about one of the farmers locally that some students you'll see later on interviewed, and he remembered one night that he was 8 years old, one day, and the sky just went black. The amount of airplanes in the sky that were flying over, and the noise at 8 years old, it scared him, and he ran and he got under the table in his father's office and hid under the table until the noise went away, and it seemed like ages. So you can imagine. There are other maps of this that are equally interesting, where you see how they took off and went into circling patterns to get themselves into formation well, so they didn't all crash into each other. And unfortunately that didn't happen, but in the main they did pretty well, and that was pretty. So that's why this part of East Anglia, I don't think can ever forget the air war in World War II, because the amount of airmen that were here in that time. And East Anglia, I'm sure, knows it owes a debt to these men, but by the amount of museums that we have in this area as well, I'm sure we do well in looking after it. Wethersfield itself, if you've been out the bus tour, you ran down that nearly 2 miles long, 1.7 miles it is, runway. That's quite a thrill, isn't it? It's one of the unique things that we have here that, luckily, thanks to the Chief Constable and his team, that they allow us to do a weekend with it. It's quiet, and so we can do that. But you can see big airfield, A-frame airfield, and the second one to be built in the United Kingdom. The first one, just 4 miles down the road, was Andrews Field, named after the famous American general that designed the A-frame airfield, which allowed them to take off no matter what the wind conditions were using any of the 3 runways. Okay. It was built 1942, they started building it. Should have been ready in 1943 as an annex to Ridgewell Airfield, and the B-17s, more B-17s were meant to move in from the 8th Air Force. But by the time they ran out of materials and concrete and cement, by the time they did finish it, it was well into 1943, and the tactics of the war had changed, and they had moved to a different style of aircraft, on bombing tactics, etc. And they were using more medium-range aircraft. So they gave it to the 9th Air Force at that time, and the 9th Air Force moved in here in 1944, right, in February. One thing about, if you were out there, you might have seen lots of different animals out there, and that's one thing that old airfields like this that don't have much public access to them are a place where, and the main one there are lots of bee orchids out there, and it's illegal to pick a bee orchid. If you pick one of these, it's a £2,000 fine. If somebody catches you, sees you, and can prove it, it's a £2,000 fine. and particularly of it's so rare.
Have you got any stone curlews yet?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Stone curlews? Stone curlews.
I'm sure there'll be some out there. That's the one that I know of the most, but there's lots of rare plants and animals out there. Okay. So 2000 to 2008, I was busy, I was doing other things. By 2008, my life was starting to quieten down a bit. I was a bit more relaxed. I used to take my dog, Rusty, and she's quite old by then, she was about 14, so I used to take her in the back of my car and drive her up to here. And we would just walk round the loop and back down here and back to the car again. That's about all she could manage. And one day, we were walking along here, and I saw this bit. And being a project manager, I thought, why didn't they just build the fence straight along there? It would have been a lot cheaper and a lot easier. And that's what got me interested in the history of Wethersfield. So I want you to look at that shape there. You can see it here, and this bit of road. So then I started to investigate that and find out why. So I found that in 1066, when the Normans came and beat the Saxons and took over England, the Norman baron that had offered up his troops to William the Conqueror was given the three parishes of Finchinfield, Toppesfield and Wethersfield. And he was given those three parishes, and he made his house here, and it was called Havishale. It was a French name. And over the years that has transformed into the English name of Hawkshall. So that's what happened to be there. And you can see the shape of the road, and if you look at this bit, I'll just go back the way, and if you look at that bit here, you can see the shape where the house was. And there's the house there, and there's the shape around it. So that's what they built. So what happened in 1959, they were extending the runway because the F-100 arrived here that I'll show you later. It needed a longer runway, and to do that, the runway, the taxiway that I was walking my dog on, came right down round here. So the Americans built a fence around it and knocked it down in 1959. There is no listed buildings in 1959, so that didn't exist. So there was nothing to stop that from happening. So that's what happened to Hawkshall. The farmers, David, Gill, somebody help me. The farm, Gill? Grimwood. David Grimwood used to live there. He was the last person to live there. David was at one of my talks, and amazingly I was talking about it and said I was interested in the history of it, and he got his wallet out. He had 10 little photographs in his wallet of the house and inside the house, and enjoyed the story very much. Well, anyway, so we move on. 2008, 2010, a retired US Air Force captain came here, and he stopped at the gate, as many would do round about that time, but he had never served here. But he had this ring with him. This is a West Point ring, and you might not be able to see it very clearly, but that says June 1943. Has a very special class at West Point in America, where the officers and the top level of officers in the American Army coming into World War II, well, because that's when the Americans joined World War II. And that class had 500 students, and they rushed them through. Normally their course took 4 years, but they rushed them through in 3 years to get them into World War II. I'm going to talk about one of the men who, out of that 500, he was in the top 50. Out of that top 50, some of those men went on to be some of the most famous men that we know in America today that survived World War II. But he was the first to die, and that was his ring. That ring turned up in a pawn shop in America in 1995. But he came here in 1994, he never went home. And you'll hear a bit more about that story in a bit later. Well, here it is now. William Edward Cranzy, and this is the retired American Air Force captain that wrote a book about him, because he found the ring. And he wanted to know about this man's inscription that was in it. Well, what he discovered was that he went on 4 missions from here in Wethersfield in 1944, and on the 4th one he never returned. And we would have expected them to have had his ring with him, so we want to know, how did the ring end up in a pawn shop? We'll have a look at that in a bit. From that though, a longer story, I'm going to try and keep the talk a bit shorter today because it's very hot and it's been a long day for you. But from that, I ended up with a project which you would have seen in the museum to go and look for William Edward Ramsay and his crew of Sergeant Henshaw and Sergeant Stewart. There were the two sergeant gunners on his aircraft. And we think we can find them one day. And some American people came over from JPAC. They are the organisation that looked for missing in action or prisoners of war. And they talked with the police team. And we had a semi-official organisation put together which allowed me access to documents that were not freedom of information to help look for Bill Ramsay. Bill came here in February 1944 and with the 416th Bomber Group. They were the first people to actually use the air base. They were in the 9th Air Force and there was 4 squadrons, 668, 669, 670 and Bill's squadron at the end here 671. Okay? I've spoken to many of the men from these and they, although they were only here for a few months, in World War II, this is one of the places that men, this is home to them, and they still think of it as home. Yeah, they still think of this as home in England. This is Bill's airplane. It's an artist's impression. That is his actual airplane on the last day, and that's the last photograph of it. He was on a mission. They left Wethersfield up here, and you can see the red dot, and they came down here, across here to Haysbrook, and they bombed a V1 site in Haysbrook. Then they went up to Dunkirk, and then back over to North Foreland and back to Wethersfield. Now, down here, they made 3 bombing runs, and on the second bombing run, Bill's airplane got hit and his left engine was out. But he still went round. He could have went home at that time, but he still had 4 bombs on his airplane, and he was determined to drop them. And he went round. He dropped the bombs, but by the time they started going to Dunkirk, he was starting to lag behind. By the time they got over the channel, he was quite well behind them, and he'd fallen behind. And there you can see, I've put the map on where they went to and how they came back. Actually, when he got to this area, he was never seen again. And the official report had him marked down as being here. But there was one thing that helped me to convince the Americans in the Pentagon that we should open up the search again and still look for Bill Ramsay's airplane. And that was because this man, Scotty Street, his name's actually Marion, yeah? And Marion, or Scotty as he preferred to be called, Scotty passed away in 2008, right? But the author of the book, Wayne, who wrote the book, had done a long interview with him and spent many hours with him. And he said that I saw Bill Ramsay's airplane here, because he called in exactly the same time for an emergency landing at Bradwell Bay Airfield, which is just up in the off the screen here. And he said, I telephoned Major Thomas when I got to Bradwell Bay, and I crash landed in Bradwell Bay, phoned up to say that me and my crew were okay, and that I'd seen Bill Ramsay, and I told Major Thomas. And this piece of handwritten paper was done by Major Thomas about that telephone call. It was never put in the official report, so it was never acted upon, and they never went out there to search for Bill Ramsay's airplane, because that's where they believed it was. Actually, on all the paperwork that I had, and I was actually working in a building just next door to here is where I had my team that I worked with, and I was working in there one day, and I was actually doing a paper and a talk I was going to do about police information and about police control rooms getting the information right. And I was actually writing about, you know, if you're going to send the police to do a search or to go and arrest somebody or search somebody's house, and it's number 24, make sure you don't say on the radio or you don't send a message, go and search the house at number 42, because that's going to cause an awful lot of problems for the people at 42, and the people at 24 are in a white van and they're driving, no offence against people with white vans, they're in a van and they're driven away down the road, yeah? So I was writing that, and at the same time, on my other desk, I had the Bill Ramsay search stuff, and I thought about it, and I thought, wait a minute, 4224. What if I swap the numbers? The actual numbers on here ends in 50. And if I swap them to 05, I actually put them there. So then the next thing I did was I started to search, and what I found was that actually at that point was right on the course back to Wethersfield that they were reported to be on. There was an aircraft wreck that was found in 1947, but never identified and never again reported. But there was a report about it, and a photograph was taken in 1966 from one of the blue Spitfires that was used in World War II with the cameras on it, and they were using that to do Admiralty charts. And he had taken a photograph, and it's a tiny little speck there, blown up to here, then blown up to here. And you can clearly see it's an aircraft. And actually, this is what Bill Cramsey's aircraft looked like. And if you look, you can start to see a similarity. And then one key thing about this aircraft that they flew, the A-20 Habit, is it had a very long nose, and there was only one pilot, so it was very thin, and that makes it quite distinctive. And over here looks like two engines, and it's come down in a sandbank. That sandbank, if any of you watching TV, watch the programme Coast, you would have seen that on Coast sometimes they show Clacton lifeboat and Southend lifeboat teams playing cricket on a sandbank. Dries out once a year in April. Actually, that's when this happened, in April. It's down here, and there's Bradwell Bay where he wanted to land. And there's the sandbank, this is where they play cricket. There's lots of aircraft wrecks on there. A lot of them because that's where the Battle of Britain was fought. So a lot of them are German, thankfully. Yeah? And the German one should have been here. And I went out there onto that sandbank, and oyster catcher took me. Been doing it since he was 18, he's in his 80s now, so I felt very safe to be with him. And Peter took me out there, and we went out and we had a look, and we found this. I was quite excited. I had to go back a second time though, because I hadn't identified anything. The second time I found metric tyre numbers on the wheel, but it was the right size of wheel, but I don't think the American aeroplane would have had metric tyre numbers. And then we discovered that it was probably a Junkers 88, but it should have been here, and we were searching here. So I thought, if that's moved from there to there, because it's a moving sandbank, what's down here? And what's down there, taken in 1971, is there's our two engines and there's this airplane. I put this in the internet, and two very well-established aircraft enthusiasts, and one of them, a well-known aircraft wreck searcher, immediately said, that's a Boston. That can't be a Boston because there's never a Boston lost in the Bradwell Bay area. And a Boston was what the English, the RAF called a Havoc. The Americans called it the Havoc, the RAF called it a Boston. So there's every possibility that's it. I've still not managed to go back out there because I retired. We're in 2012 now, and I retired. So Bill Cramsey, not in this chapel, because it wasn't built until 1952, but in 1944, on Easter Sunday, which is today, Bill was a Catholic, and he took, that's him there, and he took Holy Communion on Easter Sunday, 1944, in the chapel, which was possibly the Nissen hut just outside here, or one of the Nissen huts just outside here. He died the next day. He never came home the next day. And that was him passing out at West Point. So Bill never came home, and his crew never came home the next day. Hopefully one day we'll find them. But he's only one story, and there were many, many stories in World War II of the men who were here. In fact, if you saw in the museum where we have the American flag and we have the list, there were 70 men from Wethersfield in those few months that were here that never came home. So that was the casualties of the 416. This aeroplane is quite famous. It's in nearly every World War II book that you see. And it's actually, by the white stripe on the back, we know it's a lead aeroplane. It's an A-20 Havoc J, because it's got a glass bubble that had a bombardier and a navigator in it. And we actually know what aeroplane it was, because I know the man that took the photograph as well. And it's quite famous from the pilot, but most people that see it and the books it's in don't know the real story behind it. This was Lieutenant Stockwell's aircraft, Robert Stockwell, and the navigator in the front was Lieutenant Albert Jednak. It was hit in the middle, it went on fire, it went down, and only 2 parachutes were seen to come out of it. And that was the gunner on the bottom and the navigator, right? So the pilot and the top gunner, and you could see the top gunner looks like he didn't have much chance because he was in there. The pilot and top gunner didn't make it, so they died in World War II. The other two, Jednak and Sergeant Rust, were taken prisoner of war, and they survived the war, and they were repatriated at the end of the war. At the end of the war, Albert Jednak went to see Robert Stockwell's widow to tell her what happened and to tell her about their time in World War II. Hopefully it would bring some solace to her. Actually, they became very good friends and they got married. And the son of Jednak and Robert Stockwell's widow met at the 416th reunion. And he's very proud of the fact that the story of his father and his mother's first husband is told in this presentation. That's just one of many of the stories that was there. But it wasn't all sad. They had lots of parties here. And they had the Aero Club, that was in here, and one of the missing huts here. This is Finchinfield Village Hall, and some of these girls are all from Finchinfield. If any of you are here today, put your hand up. Because there's some American men would like to send a letter to you. And they had shows here. One of the shows, I asked some of the men when I was over in 2017 about shows that I'd seen, because up at Ridgewell they had Bing Crosby on the 2nd of September, and these men didn't leave here until the 23rd of September. They started to move on the 15th, but they hadn't all left by then. So I asked them if they went up there, and some of them had gone in trucks up to Ridgewell to see Bing Crosby. But they tell me the biggest star that they had here was Bob Hope. So they had Bob Hope, and there's a possibility that it was Bob Hope because they're laughing, and he was a good comedian. There's a possibility it was Bob Hope. That's actually the men here at Wethersfield were watching that day. And they'd make a stage in the big hangar that's out there, just to the left of this building and down the road. They make a big stage in there. They also made a boxing ring in there, and the world champion boxer Bobby Kong came, and he stayed here for 2 or 3 days. And they had a boxing competition, and the base champion then had a fight with Bobby Kong at the end. And there's lots of photographs of that. But this man, Captain Katchak, he only passed away last year. And Fran Katchak, he took 900 photographs, more than that, but he saved 900 photographs. And he took lots of film. And I've got colour film, and I've got black and white film that he took while he was here at Wethersfield during World War II. And he sent it all to me, and you see his story in the World War II room, and the story about Frank Katchak and his photography team. And he wrote down for me what it was like to be in the photography team in World War II at that time. I love these ones out of the 900, I love these. I like this one, Boomerang, but it's not my favourite. But name your airplane, but always comes home, yeah? It comes back again. So, but it's not my favourite one. You'll see my favourite one shortly. This is a famous one, Miss Lade. Miss Lade, you would have seen a model of and some pictures of in the museum. Miss Lade and this crew, that's them actually done 99 missions. They put a bomb up for every mission. That's them done 99. They're about to put the 100th up. And actually it was long before they went to France. So there's a little bit of history trickery in here, because when they went to France, it had done 100 missions. It had never been hit by a piece of flak, it had never broken down, and it had the same crew from the start of the war to the end of the war. And actually they stayed past the end of the war, and they ferried supplies and things out to people. They were one lucky crew, weren't they? They were one brilliant crew to survive and do all that. They could have went home after 65 missions. They done something like 140 missions, these men. Yeah? And they could have went home after 65. That was all they had to do on these medium bombers. So if you've seen Memphis Belle, And Memphis Belle's about the first B-17 to do 25 missions, and then the crew could go home. And a while after that, I think it was Doolittle, he passed it up to 35 missions, because they were getting fewer and fewer men for the bombs. These men had to do 65. They weren't as dangerous as the big B-17s. They weren't flying over the big cities of Germany. Their job, and it annoyed them, these men have told me it annoyed them, their job was to appease Winston Churchill. He wanted to appease the people in London by having the B-1 sites hit, and they got the job of doing that here. And that was their job to go. They got told by the intelligence people at Medmenham, where this headquarters used to be at Medmenham, they got told by those people, Dirk Bergard, he worked down there, and they did the spy, the aerial photographs, that blue Spitfire. They'd see a V1 site, and then they'd send a message here, and they'd go out and they'd bomb it. Anyway, when they went to France, they renamed it La France Libre, and it's a famous aircraft. All the models of an A-20 Havoc that you'll find are that airplane. They're all wrong. It's a story I can tell in the museum, but we'll move on. So 100 missions, and they renamed it. This is my favourite though. The Pink Lady. The Pink Lady doesn't have bombs on it, it has whiskey bottles on it. And they had a bottle of whiskey every time they came home. And actually, I thought, you can see, if you can see that clearly, they're actual whiskey labels. And I spoke to the pilot many times, Wayne, and I'm going to tell you about Wayne just now. He's standing there. Wayne told me they weren't all whiskey bottle labels. Some of those labels were wine bottle labels, because they couldn't always get a bottle of whiskey. But his crew chief, while they went away, the crew chief's job was to go into Braintree and try and get hold of a bottle of whiskey from one of the hotels or bars there to bring back for them to drink when they got back. And then they would lacquer, he'd paint on the bottle, they'd lacquer on, and they'd lacquer on the label on the top. The Pink Lady. So who was the Pink Lady? There's Wayne there, that's Wayne on the aircraft, there he is. And there's Wayne when I met him in 2017. The Pink Lady was Norma. Norma was a nurse in Bristol. In fact, I'd like to mention that we've been recognised by the American Embassy, and the American Embassy have put Wethersfield on the World War II interactive map that they're doing for D-Day, and they've also put this story on, and they've put this story on in Bristol, because Norma was a nurse in Bristol. She was a lieutenant in the US Army at the field hospital that was ready to go out after the invasion. Wayne actually flew these aircraft. They flew the first A-20 into the United Kingdom, and he started at Kieval before he came to Wethersfield. And he started on the A-20A and the A-20B. And at Kieval, they took all the officers up to the hospital, because only officers were allowed to dance with the nurses. And at Kieval, he was a lieutenant and she was a lieutenant, and they met and they danced the first dance, and they were together the rest of their life till she died in 2012, and Wayne passed away just last year. But their story is more remarkable. That same in Bristol. When Wayne was here, he used to do training missions, and he was allowed to go 2 hours and 2 hours back again. But he'd only ever get 2 hours to Kieval, and his plane would break down mysteriously, and there'd be a piece missing. And he'd be there for 2 days or 3 days before he came back again. Not only that, Wayne did way over 65 missions. In fact, I asked Wayne about that, and he told me, he said, well, Norma got moved over to France in August after the invasion with the field hospital. She was at the Battle of Paris. And he said, and we were still over here. He said, so I want to go and see Norma. And the only way I could get a 7-day pass to get to France was to do 25 missions in a row. So I volunteered to do other people's missions for him that didn't want to go. He got his 25 missions and got a 7-day pass. He hitchhiked all the way down to Dover. He then used a bottle of whiskey and some cigarettes to get on a minesweeper, and he got himself to France. Got some Americans to take him in a jeep to where Norma's field was, and he spent 4 or 5 days there, and then he did the same thing all the way back again. When they moved to France in September, it was only a month before they got married in the cathedral in Cherbourg, and the the mayor married them. As the mayor married them, there was a coffin and a funeral service. As they were walking down the aisle, there was a funeral service going out there. The mayor married them, and then again at the chateau that it talks about in the newspaper thing there, US Army held a second service for them, and the US chaplain remarried them again. So they were married twice in France in October, before the war was over. Okay. Another pilot was Dave Andrews, and Dave came here in 2013. He also went to Normandy then, and he went back to Normandy in 2014. Dave went up to Duxford with me, and we went to Manningley Cemetery. Dave was in the aircraft right beside, behind Bill Cramsey, and was one of Bill Cramsey's friends and in the same squadron. So it meant a lot for us to go to see where Bill's name is on the wall of the missing and his crew. And there are 9 names from the 416th on the wall of the missing, alongside John Kennedy Jr. and what's the band man that I mentioned a little while ago? Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller's name is on that wall as well, and so is John Kennedy Jr. Yeah, so we went there. He was here. That's the other hangar up at the top of the airfield. The glider school used to be in there. We only went in for 10 minutes. An hour and a half later, I had to ask if we could move on because it was starting to get a bit late in the day. They didn't want them to leave. He was telling them wonderful stories. His airplane, World War II, was in that hangar, and their gliders were in there. Yeah, and then we had the Cold War ones in there in between. When they went back to Normandy in 2014, he stayed at a place where he was able to look at the rail yard and Marshall Yard that he bombed in June 1944 and see the same area. Yeah. Dave's still with us, not too well at the moment, but he's still with us, and hopefully it will be at the next reunion. Sadly, I think there will only be 2 of them left for the next reunion in Louisiana in October this year. So what did they do on D-Day here, and June the 6th from here? Well, 2 missions. At 3 o'clock in the morning, they had lots of airplanes going across, and that was the first people that were going to parachute in before the landing in daylight. And they had lots of heavy aircraft, so they knew something was going on. These stripes had been painted onto their airplane just the day before, on the 5th of June. Yeah. So, but it had many false starts. So they kind of thought about it, but the 3 o'clock in the morning wake-up call, that kind of said something big's going on. The officers were taken down to the briefing centre, which was actually just outside this building, just behind this building. It's not there now. And they were locked in there for the rest of the day because they were told what their mission were. And their mission was at 1 o'clock to go to Argentan to bomb a rail yard, a marshalling yard. And then later on in the day, they would go to Serquex to do the same. The first mission that they flew out on to Argentan, 57 airplanes went. Every single one came back. The Germans were not expecting them. And like I say, it's quite sad because they actually flattened the town, not just the marshalling yard, because all 57 airplanes hit the target and more than the target. So, in fact, if I go back to that, we should see, but the town's still there, and that's it today, it'll be rebuilt. You can see there's not a lot of difference. Yeah. So, this was the second one though, where there weren't so many aircraft went. In fact, there was only 30-something aircraft went to that one, and the Germans were waiting for them at this one because this was a really strategic one. This one was full of trains with Panzer tanks on the back, ready to move up to the front line. And, but they bombed it to pieces. Some of these men got the Distinguished Air Medal from America. I think there was 2 given out that day for this mission. 8 of the airplanes were so badly hurt, 3 of them didn't come home. The 5 that did come home were absolutely riddled with flak and holes and had to crash land because their hydraulics were out, the brakes were out, they couldn't put their landing gear down, all sorts of problems. And so there was a few medals earned that day, but as I say, 3 of the aircraft didn't go home. On those 3 aircraft there was 10 men. Sometimes they carried 4 if they had a bomb aimer, and other times they carried 3. So that was a 4 and 2 3s. All the details are there. You can't read them, but I'm going to tell you one story, the one at the bottom here, because 8 of those men out of the 10 were captured and became prisoners of war, repatriated at the end of the war. But these 2 didn't go home. That's Sergeant Louis Mazza and Sergeant Henry Ahern's, right? I'm going to tell you a little bit about this one because that's what the newspaper comes about. His mother had received the usual telegram, your son is missing in action, right? So she's had some hope and that her son was missing in action. The mother of the other sergeant and her were in contact, and they contacted the mother of the pilot. Remember, these men were only 20 years old. Bill Cramsey was 24 years old. Dave Andrews that I talked about there, he was one of the youngest. He was only 21 years old when he was flying that aircraft. Yeah. The oldest one, Bob Kerrs, is the one that's the fittest and still alive. He was 31 and he's 104 now. And he's fit as a fiddle, lives on his own, very independent. Anyway, Louis Mazza's mother then contacted the pilot and she said, oh, I've had a telegram, my son's a prisoner of war. So that's what the newspaper article in this part's about. She wrote to the Air Force and said, the pilot's a prisoner of war. Can you get in contact with him somehow? Are you able to contact him if he's a prisoner of war and find out what happened to my son? Well, they weren't able to do that, but they didn't need to, because they found out later that, if we go back to it, they found out later that these 2, although they had parachuted out the airplane and they had landed, they were caught by different Germans, and they were caught by the Gestapo, not by the Germans that played by the rule in the Geneva Convention. They were shot in the woods. They never even got the chance to become prisoners of war. They were just shot. Yeah. So that's what happened to her son. So the next telegram she got was to say, we've discovered what happened. His body was found in the woods and he was shot. Yeah. So he was never taken prisoner of war. And that's why she received the medal after that. Okay. When they moved out, the RAF moved in. And so this is October 1944, just a few weeks after the Americans had left, and 299 and 196 squadrons moved in. They worked for the 38th Flight, who did special missions for SOE, that's spies, the Special Operations Executive. They were mostly based at Audley End House, down by Saffron Walden, and that's where they trained to be spies. And they would come up here in the night, they go in an airplane. We've got the flight records are up in the museum. If you read them, you'll see it usually just says cargo was 2 friends. That's all it says. And that tells you cargo was 2 friends means that was 2 spies. They took them over in the darkness, 1 airplane, they parachuted into wherever they were going. The other one that you would see, which my grandfather was on, was a Rummy. Cargo was 12 Rummy, and that's what they called an SAS unit. A Rummy, so that was their language for that. And on the 26th of October, you can see they took a 12 Rummy over to France and dropped them into France. And my grandfather, as I found out in 2017, was on that. We'll see that story a bit later. One crew in particular, though, this one, bittersweet. The son of the pilot contacted me. I hadn't put it together because the daughter of the navigator also contacted me, and I hadn't put the 2 together, that these men actually worked together. The daughter of the navigator contacted me because her mother had passed away, and they'd gone to clear the house out, and they had a lot of her father's RAF stuff from Wethersfield, but her mother was from the village, and her name was Frida King. She lived in the first street on the left where the fire station is. And Frida, at 18 years old, married this Australian in the middle here, and went out to Australia in 1945 with them, and they lived out there. And so she worked in the silk factory, and you'll see that there. and she made her own wedding dress from parachute silk. She was an inspectress of the quality of the silk, and all the scraps and parts that weren't good enough she kept, and she made her wedding dress from it in 1945. It's now in Braintree Museum because the doctor sent it over here. But then I put two and two together when I was reading the history of the man from Canada that sent his father's history over, and they were actually on the same airplane. And that was his father there. He was the pilot, and he was a Canadian. And then they both sent me lots of photographs, and I put the whole thing together. And we contacted all the families. Only one man was alive, and that's the one on the end, and he was still alive and in Australia, but he had just started to get dementia, and he was in a hole. But we were able to send some of the information and all the pictures and the stories. His family never knew what he did in World War II. And it was a thing about Australian men, because it was frowned upon in Australia, because a lot of Australians felt that the bomb crews bombed innocent people in Germany and killed women and children when they were dropping their bombs. So they were they never talked about it in Australia because it was frowned upon, because they were looked upon as not as war heroes, but as having done something bad. So he never talked about it to anybody. So they didn't find about his history until just a few months before he passed away. But he was able to share that with them, and we were able to get some of his stories. And I've got some wonderful stories from him. I can't share them now because we'll be here all day, but some wonderful stories. Barry, we unveiled the bench too, so, but Barry, as I talked about, had the nose bag. He was a pilot with that squadron in World War II, and Barry then became the caterer. He said that was probably the worst thing that ever happened to him in his life, going from flying officer to catering officer. And he said, how was that a promotion? But he was here, and if he hadn't been, he would have met his wife Bailey. And they ran a restaurant down, and he was always up here. He was always part of it. And I love that phrase, in a friendly Air Force atmosphere. And we spoke about Barry earlier. 4,000 marriages here. That's why people come back here nearly every week to visit and to see the place where grandma and or mum and dad, or grandma and grandpa met each other and got married. Some of them in this very church. One of the stories is on the notice board at the back in this very chapel here. The museum came about because this couple, Carol and Bruce Simmer, they tried to come here 2005, 2008. Carol is from Braintree originally, lives in Florida now, and his last dying wish, Bruce's last was to make his third attempt to come here, to have his ashes scattered here. They're on the site up by the test bed, because that's where he used to work. And his friend Tom Barr over here had a brain tumour, but came over a year later to visit that site. And we had a wonderful, he stayed here for a week, and I looked after him for a week. I had the most fantastic time with Tom. You'll see that. We held a party in the social centre you were in. It was in America. He wanted a 1950s pub party, like he used to remember in the villages. And that's what we held from. We had sing-songs and everything. In fact, he also at that party, two of his old girlfriends turned up from when he was here in the 1950s. Yeah, there's 5 sisters, and he dated 2 of them. So from the village. I'm not going to mention their names because there's 4 of them are still alive. They're still down the village, but they know the story. They've been here. Well, Tom passed away about 6 months after he'd been here, but his family said, coming here gave him that extra 6 months. So his ashes are there now as well. Tom and I there. I love that photograph. He was a mechanic in the maintenance squadron in the F-100. Fantastic photograph in the rows of the F-100. He was with the 20th Fighter Bomber Wing, Tactical Fighter Wing as they were later called, in 1957 when they changed to the F-100. This is the site. The museum is there, down here in this area. That's the museum there. And that's what was the officers' club. Those 2 houses you can see over the hedge. There was no hedge there then. And there we go. There's the chapel that we're in now in 1952. That's it being built. and that was the headquarters building that these two gentlemen at the front were lucky enough to go in today. Norman there, that's his office there, those two windows. George had an office at the back, so he could see the airplanes, because he just sat and watched the airplanes all day while Norman was doing all the paperwork at the front. So they were. One of the most famous base commanders, though, was Colonel Tolliver. He's probably the most famous American in this area. If anybody talks about the base and can remember a base commander's name, it's Colonel Tolliver. That's probably because he had the most famous airplane. That was the Triple Zilch, which was copied many times, and you'd see lots of photographs and models in the museum. They came here though with the F-84 Thunderstreak, and they carried a nuclear bomb, the first nuclear bomb in the United Kingdom. They didn't actually come to Wethersfield first, they went to somewhere in Kent first. They didn't have the nuclear bomb then though, but we were building up the tactics against the East Germany and the Soviet Pact, the USSR at that time, the Warsaw Pact. We were building up the tactics against that. And then the Americans managed to design a small tactical nuclear bomb that could be dropped on a unit of tanks or infantry that was moving towards West Germany. And they fitted it there, but they brought them here to Wethersfield once they designed that. The British designed one as well, but the British one was nearly the size of this chapel, and the airplane that had to carry it was called the Vulcan. If you go to Duxford, you can walk underneath the bomb bay, and it's like walking into this chapel and looking up. Theirs was called, I think it was the Big Boy, I think they called the British one. There is a picture of it in the museum, yeah. But the American one was quite small. Then the Americans also invented a supersonic airplane. This is the first supersonic airplane, faster than the speed of sound, to roll off the factory floor just like Ford cars, because they mass manufactured this airplane and they rolled it out, and it could go faster than the speed of sound. And they came here to Wethersfield, and many people, in fact, I think it was Barry's daughter, you were telling me today about these windows were smashed because of one of these jets, and at Spain's Hall, where the family up at the Lord Lieutenant up at Spain's Hall, his windows were smashed because of the supersonic boom from these airplanes. Also, because they never admitted in these days, it's well known now, there's plenty of photographs around, and it's quite well known in the newspaper reports and things, but they never admitted. But the C&D tracked the day because they came here, they had a big march, as they did at the same time at Easter again, and from Aldermas, but they also marched from Wethersfield to London against, there was 800 arrests at the lovely village of Finchfield. They're all gathered there to march up to Wethersfield. 800 arrests. There's actually, you can find the newsreel on TV if you search for Wethersfield CND 800 arrests. You'll find quite a long news story about it and see what happened on the day. There's one of those American bombs. If anybody gets the picture to that, that's it's on the 320th. They were the 320th MMS, were the munitions squadron, and they were over in the bomb dump. Did the bus go around the bomb dump today? Yeah, so you've seen the bomb dump. They were over there, and this chap sitting on the bomb. There was a film that came up around about that time, and it was called Dr. Strangelove. And at the end of the film, there's a nuclear bomb, and Dr. Strangelove is sitting just like that in the same pose on the film. So that's what that pose is about. Okay. A couple of famous people that were here during the Cold War is Colonel Bud Day. Colonel Bud Day lived here, and he lived in the first house in the married quarters as you go down there. And his office was just as you go up the runway, called Building 66. It's a red horse office. His son, Colonel Bud's no longer with us, but his son told me that he ran a telephone line from the bedroom of his house upstairs all the way up to his office. He did that himself, so he could have a direct line between his house and his office if he wanted. Colonel Bud went to Vietnam after here, and in Vietnam, that's where he became really famous because he was shot down. He had his own squadron over there, and he's name, his call sign there was Misty One. He fell in love with the song Misty, and actually the story goes that when he went home on leave to America one time, he bought 12 copies of the record and brought them back here and gave them everybody in his squadron a copy of the song Misty. So his call sign became Misty One. He was shot down in Vietnam, he was captured, he was put in a Vietnam prison and in the jungle, but he escaped after a few days. He got within 50 yards of getting to the American line. The Americans could see him, but they couldn't do anything because it would attract, but he had a large open space to try and get across to get back to the Americans. They knew he was there, he knew they could see him, and then at the moment he made his run, the Viet Cong captured him again. So this time they took him to Hanoi, the famous Hanoi Hilton, and they put him in there. And for the next 5 years, he shared a cell with Senator John McCain. And the two of them spent 5 years in jail before they were released by the Viet Cong and repatriated again. The other man here, Doc Blanchard, those that know American football, Doc Blanchard in the 1950s was one of the most famous football players. He was never in the NFL, actually turned it down to come to Wethersfield. He had a choice to be a pick in the NFL or to come to Wethersfield as a pilot, and you can see an interview of him, we have that in the museum, where he says, I went for Wethersfield, that was the better bet. And in his book, he actually writes, and both of them actually write, that Wethersfield was the best tour of duty in their whole time in the RAF. That's quite a common thread through most of the Air Force men. A film was made about him because he was Mr. Inside to another West Point students, Mr. Outside, and they were in the Army team, and they won most of the games. He was known as number 35, and he was known as Mr. Inside, and the other one was Mr. Outside. They made a film about him called The Spirit of West Point, and you can still find that on YouTube today. We remember the 9 pilots from the Cold War. There would be more, but we haven't finished the research on it yet, but these 9 were all pilots of the F-100. It was quite unstable, it was quite a heavy airplane, and it didn't always fly too well, so there was quite a few lost. So those 9 pilots are remembered in the museum. In the museum, you'll see the Victor Alert area. You would have driven around there and heard about it today, so I won't say too much about it, but that's where they were loaded up with the nuclear bombs ready to go to war. As far as I know, from what I've been told, 2 times they actually took off and went into a holding pattern. That was the day that John Kennedy was shot and assassinated, and the other day was the day the Cuba missile crisis, because America was so near to going to war with Russia over the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had lots of air shows here from 1953. We've got film of the 1953 air show, and all the way to 1988. Okay. 50 to 60,000 visitors coming up that little lane. It was a one-way system actually. You came in the back gate and you went out the front gate, I believe. Okay. So in 2015, after Bruce and Tom's ashes, and Tom had been here, I managed to have 2 rooms for visitors, and that was the start of the museum. Some of the other occupants, 1947, after the war, Chipperfield Circus were here. It was full of elephants and lions, tigers, monkeys, and they used to escape, and snakes as well. This is where Chipperfields kept all the circus animals during the winter months, from all the ones that were touring Europe came to Wethersfield. In 1970, the 66 came in, and they looked after the base while it was in care and maintenance. In 1979, the Red Horse arrived. The Red Horse, they repaired runways all over Europe, or anywhere that the American Air Force was, even Vietnam. In fact, they were founded in Vietnam and specialized in repairing runways. They were here. They left in 1990. Oh, here's an airplane. You might have seen this one a few times today, this airplane. This young man over here, world record breaker in 1976. He's sitting in the front row, if any of you aren't aware. He might get up and say a few words at the end, just about his time here. Yeah, and his pilot I'll say Al, because I can't say Eldon Jerez. So I'll say Al. Pilot Al and George, Colonel G.T. Morgan. They flew in this aircraft, and 2,193 miles per hour. He might tell you a little bit what that feels like. Well, it's you tell them that, 2,200, yeah. Somebody wrote that down wrong as well. Yeah. So there we go. And actually, they still know each other. They're both still with us. There they are. Not 1976, a good few years later, you can tell. And I had the opportunity to have my photograph taken with George today as well. And there's the two of us doing a similar pose. Okay. The Emily Police came in 1991, as I said. I came up to have a look, but I didn't like it, so I went back to Scotland. If you haven't guessed, I was from there. These are the students that came in 2016 from Texas to help me start the museum, and they did a study of World War II in the area. They did 12 interviews of people that had memories from World War II in Wethersfield and Finchleyfield, and we have them in the museum. They had a great time, and the museum was started, and you'll see it. I don't know if you noticed up in the museum, but one of the amazing things up there is the amount of acts that were here. We had David Bowie, before he was famous, Tom Jones, Engelbert Humperdinck, Lulu, the Small Faces, the Beatles were even here as the Quarrymen. I'm told that the Rolling Stones were here when they first started. The Georgie Fame was the most prolific one to keep coming back again. He would be up here most Fridays, and then they'd all load him and his band's stuff into the back of a two-tonner, drive it down to London, and he'd go to the Flamingo Club. He actually wrote a song recently about the Flamingo Club, and he mentions the men from Wethersfield being there and a number of the other airfield. Yeah. And he mentions something about there were no eagles around, so I guess he means there was no officers at the Flamingo Club because it was an all-night party, and it was only the enlisted men that went with them. Yeah. And you've seen the museum. And that's how we came to be. There's Graham. That's Graham from there. The tower's gone sadly. 2009 it was knocked down. But we've got good history and photographs. And Graham at the back, he's sitting at the back there, one of the volunteers, he built us these fantastic models. And we can always remember it from that. It's easier to remember it from that than it is from a photograph. Good. And we started to open up not just American visitors from America. The Chief Constable allowed us to have some groups and local people to come in. Hence you're here today. Not because of us, I have to say you're here because the Chief Constable and the head of establishment, his civilian officer, allow us to be able to do this. So we have to thank them for that. 2017 I was awarded a medal from America for my work in preserving American Air Force history. The Bledsoe Medal. George Bledsoe was a pilot in World War II, and he was a school teacher and taught music. And he believed in preserving history. Some of the team you recognise are. I went to Washington in 2017. And there's Dave Andrews here, Wayne down the front, and Joe Meager. Joe just passed away. Bob Kersh, and I've got to apologise because I've forgotten that gentleman's name at the moment. And there I am with Dave Andrews, and there I am with Bob Kersh and Wayne. Wayne with his lollipop. And then the last thing, as I mentioned, is 2017. I've been here since 2017 years. And then somebody in my family was researching our grandfather. I was the oldest grandson. He left all his military memorabilia to me, and I had it all. And they phoned me up to ask me, what do you know about a place called the Mushroom Farm? I said, well, that's actually where I'm at. It's where I have my museum, at the Mushroom Farm. Well, I've discovered that that missing part of Grandad's history, where he went to fight with the Free French, he was with the SAS. And that's where we found out that he parachuted into France from Wethersfield. He spent a month here. He lived at a place up by the glider school hangar called the Mushroom Farm. And he lived up there with the SAS. It was an SAS headquarters. and 11 Frenchmen that he helped to train, and they trained and they learned to parachute here on the airfield for a month. And then once they were ready and the mission was ready, they went to Epernay, and then they just blended in, and then they would go out in jeeps, 2 at a time, and they would go out with a Bren gun and they'd shoot as many of the German military vehicles and war machine that was pushing towards those that were coming up from the beaches from D-Day. So there he was. That's actually the crew of Bittersweet. That's the Australian man, one of the Australians I was talking about. The 2 English, 2 RAF, 3 Australians, and 1 pilot was Canadian on that crew. And that's him taking an SAS crew over to France. And that's the last slide. But what last year, for the first time ever, the Wethersfield and the museum represented the men of the 416 and all the Americans that were here by going to the American Memorial Day on the 27th of May, and we laid 2 wreaths. One of the sons of one of the men from the 416 came over from America, and he laid one on behalf of the 416 Bomb Group Association, and I laid one on behalf of the museum and the team here, and the whole team was there with me. It was a wonderful day. We met the Brigadier General from Mildenhall there. It was his first day, and we had a good half-an-hour chat with him and told him all about the museum. So that's us. I don't know if George would like to come up and talk a little about what it was like in the 1980s, or if you have any questions, you can ask me or George, and he can just answer you from there, really. Yeah?